Welcome to Sunday School at Second Baptist Church. As I told you last week, we're going to divert from the student book this week and next week. And instead of going on into the Song of Songs as the student book suggested, we're going to go into Ecclesiastes. And you could study Ecclesiastes for more than 2 weeks for sure. It's a short book, but it has a lot of things in it. But what I'm going to do is just hit the highlights of the first part this week and the second part next week, and then starting in the next quarter, which will be the beginning of September, we'll go back to the student book. And the student book is available at the church now. And so if you come to the service, or if you want to stop by the office during the week and get a copy of the student book, that would be great. And if not, we'll be in the book of Isaiah. I think I might have said Jeremiah last week, but it is Isaiah that's coming up. So that should be very interesting. But let's start then on Ecclesiastes. And I looked up the meaning of the word Ecclesiastes, and it refers back to, or the meaning is from the Greek, and it means something like a congregation or a group of people. So I think because this book is called Ecclesiastes, that you can imagine King Solomon maybe gathering a large congregation at which time he presented these thoughts, because this is short enough that it could have been an event, an occasion where these things were presented to a congregation of people that all heard it at once. And of course, King Solomon is the writer. It says in verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. But it is attributed to King Solomon, who was the son of David. And I view Ecclesiastes as a sort of conclusion of the Proverbs. It feels that way to me. And it may not feel that way to everybody, but that is the way it comes across to me. It's almost like he's taken all these things now that he's talked about in the Proverbs, and he's kind of wrapped them all up into the book of Ecclesiastes, sort of a summary. So we're going to break it down a little bit and see what Solomon concluded about wisdom, on the topic of wisdom. He had studied many things, and we know from the history books that he studied every kind of animal and plant and all sorts of things in his lifetime. He was very wise in many ways, and did many building projects and all sorts of things that he accomplished within his lifetime. It's amazing, really. But in this conclusion of life, and I would think that he wrote this when he was getting to be an older person. He first starts off by talking about futility, or the futility of everything is what he talks about at the beginning of the first chapter. The first part of the first chapter is all about just the futility of everything. How everything is, when I think of futility, maybe a waste of time. It's just pointless. And so he says, at the beginning, he says, everything is just futile. There's nothing new under the sun. What happened before is happening again. And in verse 9, he does exactly say that. There is nothing new under the sun. And so he's observed his whole life all of these things happening. And he's come to the conclusion that there's just nothing new. It's just whatever happened before happens over and over again. And we do see that in the lives of people where they don't learn from the mistakes of others. They have to repeat those mistakes themselves. After that, continuing in chapter 1, he talks about the futility of wisdom. And he says, I've learned all these things. I've studied the topic of wisdom, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And then he says in verse 18 of chapter 1, in much wisdom there's much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. So he came to that conclusion about his wisdom, was that the more you know, it just causes you pain. And I guess I could see that. If you're oblivious to the problems of the world, then maybe you're just happy-go-lucky because you don't know and you don't care. But the more you learn, maybe it draws you into the realities of life in a more acute way, and you do feel pain from it. So, all the things, the wisdom that Solomon had was revered and awe-inspiring, the amount of wisdom that he had. And so for him to then conclude that really it just caused him pain to have that much wisdom. Now he's going to get to a point. It's not all negative in this book. But then we go on to chapter 2. So we're still on the futilities. Now he talks about the futility of pleasure and possessions. And he details a lot of things. And you should go and read that list about all the things he did. He built houses, he made vineyards and gardens and parks and fruit trees and ponds, and all of these things he did and possessed and made for his pleasure, so that he lived in the most beautiful places and, designed those himself and everything. And then he says that is just, it was a futile effort. It is a futility to do all of those things. He said it's all just vanity, is what he called it. And then he goes on from there, he begins to talk about being wise versus being foolish. And he says that the same fate, whether you're a wise person or you're a foolish person, the same fate comes to everybody. Basically, you're going to die in the end, whether you're wise or foolish. At the end of your life comes death. So he says this is vanity too, because you, whether you tried your best to be wise and do things wisely, or you were just foolish and just made a lot of bad decisions, at the end you've got the same fate. And then he talks about the futility of labor. And he says, in verses 18 through the end of chapter 2, he says, basically, you work all your life, and then at the end of it, you're going to give it to someone who hasn't worked at all. So what's the point, I guess, is what he's saying. It's vanity. All of these things are vanity. So that's his conclusion at the beginning now. That's the first 2 chapters. And it just seems like there was no point to most of the things that he did in his life. This is the way he's feeling. And you can see that, you can see that when you get to be my age. And I don't consider myself to be, about to kick the bucket, but who knows? I might. But I'm at the latter end of life, I'll say. And, you look back some days and you just think, what did I really do? I have accomplished a lot of paperwork in my life, that's for sure. But what did I really do? What things really counted? And of course, there's references in the Bible to the fact that our works are going to be burned up. At the last days, the things that we did are really nothing to God in His greatness. Our little efforts. However, He does have things He wants us to do, and we participate in those. And those things that we do that God wanted us to do, those are the most important things that we do in life. You may do something in a day that seemed insignificant, but that may end up, even if you don't remember it, that may end up being the most important thing you did in your life, because it affected another person in some way that caused a chain reaction, and it was just what God wanted you to do. And that's an amazing thing to think about. So now we go on to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, and I encourage you to go and read in Ecclesiastes. It's not long, and you can read through it within the week, and then next week will be towards the end of the book. So in chapter 3, there's this very famous section which gets used in weddings sometimes and things like that, where he says there's a time for everything under heaven. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, and a time to heal, and it goes on and on with the time for everything. A time for war and a time for peace. And so, again, he's concluding, after his observation, his amazing mental capacity and his observation of life for all these years, now he's concluding there seems to be a time for everything. Some things happen in this way or that way, and there seems to be a time for all of these things. And then I feel like once he gets to that point, he begins to make some statements about God and how God works in the world. Because really, all of those first things may be man's activities, we'll call it that. But then when you get down to what God does, now you're getting down to what's important, what's really important. And so let's read a few excerpts. We won't be able to read everything and go, verse by verse by verse through the book. But let's read some excerpts and let's talk about those. So the first thing I want to read is in chapter 3, verses 11 to 14. He, meaning God, He has made everything appropriate in its time. So this follows right after he was saying there's an appointed time for everything, a time to heal and a time to kill, etc. He has made everything appropriate in its time, or another translation of that is beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take away from it. For God has so worked that men should fear Him. So, he says, God has a time for everything, and we know that God has His timing. We talk about that sometimes. How things happen in God's timing. And that's so hard to understand when you're young. I remember when our youngest son was hoping to find the person that he would marry. And he was so impatient and felt like it was never going to happen. And we told him, it won't happen until it happens. But when it happens, you'll know it. It's in God's timing. And oh, that was not what he wanted to hear. I mean, he just, it's just so hard when you're young. But as you get older and you look back on it, you realize that God's timing is active in everything, every part of life. And he is at work in our lives. And we can see it from the big picture if we look back. And then it also puts things into perspective. In other words, all of these things that we do, our labor, the things we possess, and the work that we do, the wisdom that we try to have, everything is a futile effort if we don't have God in it. God makes those things appropriate. He puts them in perspective. And he does want us to do things. He doesn't want us to just sit around and say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what I do because none of it matters. That's not the attitude that we should have. But having God in those things that we do, and always fearing God and revering God and allowing him to work in our lives, then the things that we do are put into perspective and they become relevant and they become important things that we do. And then another part of that I just read, it says God has set eternity in men's hearts, but he's not given us the full picture. It says, yet so that men will not find out the work which God has done. So in other words, he has given us a glimpse of things to come. He has given us enough knowledge that we can understand that there is a real thing called eternity, and we have to make a decision about following God and entering eternity as a follower of Jesus or not. So he's given us that much knowledge, but he has not given us the full picture of what all he's doing. And there's probably a lot of good reasons that he hasn't done that. We could imagine what we might do with that information if we knew the end from the beginning as God does. And we knew that X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Then we would adjust the things that we do accordingly. And that would probably not be good, So God has set eternity in our hearts, though, so that we can know. And I think this is, it really fits with something that I've observed, and that is that no matter how remote we go in the world, and we've been to some very remote places in Africa, but then those people that have been to places like Papua New Guinea and other places, islands in the South Pacific, where they thought they were the only people on earth, let's say. But then when outsiders have gone into there, they have observed that the people were worshiping a higher power. They realized that there was God of some sort, and they were worshiping him to the best of their ability with the knowledge that they had and the way that they had figured it out, maybe. But still, God has set eternity in our hearts. He has caused our hearts to understand that there's more than us. There is a higher power, that God is there. And, in modern society, I guess, some people, intellectuals, they try to say, oh no, God is just a crutch that people came up with. But if you observe these remote people groups, as people come across them, then you find out that everywhere you go, there's not a place on earth where people don't understand that there is a God. Everywhere on earth. That is common knowledge among people. It's really amazing when you think about it. And then he goes on after this section. Now I'm going into chapter 4, where he begins to talk about the evils of oppressors. And he talks about how, oppressors are wicked, and they treat people badly, and people work for the wrong reasons. It's a competition and other things like that. And again, he takes a negative tone in saying that basically the dead are better off than those who are alive because of the oppression of life. And he says the really ones that are the best off are those who never existed. So that almost sounds like despair, doesn't it? But he's just letting his feelings come through, and sometimes I would never have thought that I could have had a thought like that. But recently, and before I started studying this recently, I had the thought I saw in the obituaries, which we have many obituaries now as people are passing away. And an elderly person had passed away. And I thought, at least that person is being spared now. They were Christian. They're being spared from the difficulty of these days. And so, I think that may be sort of what Solomon was thinking, is that those who have passed on are no longer under an oppression of life. They have gone to be with God in a much better place. And then he comes down to verses 9 through 12, and here's another, what I'll call a nugget that we're going to look at. And so I'm going to read chapter 4, verses 9 to 12 now. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, 2 can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. And so this is at the end of the section about being oppressed and the evil oppressors in life. And he's saying, what I get from it is that we're better off when we are together in life and we can encourage each other. Where if one of us feels low, the other one feels good that day, and we can lift that person up, and then on another day, maybe we are feeling low and that other person is up and they can lift us up. And that is the way it should be in our community of Christian believers, is that a part of the reason that we are a community of Christians is because we lift each other up. And when one of us is feeling bad and feeling down or sick or something like that, then the others surround them, and we see that happening. And they are encouraged, they're supported, and they're lifted up. And so it's always better for us to do things together. And then the last part that I'm going to cover today is right at the beginning of chapter 5. And I'll read verses 1 and 2 there at the beginning of chapter 5. Guard your steps as you go to the house of God, and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven, and you are on the earth. Therefore, let your words be few. So, again, he's turned a corner, and he's given us a nugget here of how to live life in a good way. And just like he said, support each other in the part that I just covered. Now in this, he's saying, guard your steps as you go to God. And when you come close to God, Come close to Him to listen. So, you know, this is important for us because often we pray, we boldly, you know, some thoughts, I guess, religious thoughts, are that you boldly approach God, you know, and you hear that sometimes. But we go without thinking about it to God and just ask for things and lay it all out there, you know, and complain to God and whatever. And we just let it all fly. And I think, you know, this verse is reminding us that when we go close to God, we don't need to offer the sacrifice of fools, which may be many words or much boasting, or going to God and saying, you know, you must help me with this, or I claim in Jesus' name that you're going to do this thing, you know, whatever. But with many words, we make ourselves foolish to God. And God already knows how foolish we are, because we are, you know, we all are. And I'm not beginning to say that we don't ask God for things. But what this verse is telling us is, don't be hasty. Don't be impulsive in asking God for things. Think it through. Think about who you're talking to when you're asking God for things. Come close to God and listen, because God will speak to you. And He will guide you to even to ask for the things that you need to ask for. There's that verse, and I should have looked that up, where it says, I'll bring it next time. But it talks about God will give you the thoughts, the desires of your heart. And, you know, I always thought that meant God's going to give you whatever you desire. That's not what it means. It means He will even guide you to desire the things that He wants you to desire His will. So if we don't take away anything else from today but that, let's try this week to make an effort to listen to God. What is God telling me? How can God put my life into perspective this week? How can He make everything that seems so futile and so chaotic, how can God put that all together and help it to make sense for us in a way that we can remember and we can understand that He has this big plan. And even though we have eternity in our hearts and we have that glimpse, but He has the big plan, and He knows the end from the beginning, and He has it all under control. And we can trust Him in that this week. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you being there every week, and I pray that you have a good week. And we will conclude with some things from the ending part of Ecclesiastes next week. Thank you.